The case file was 847 pages long. It had been organized, catalogued, and routed through proper channels by a man who knew exactly what it contained, and exactly what it never would. His name was on the cover page, not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, but as the lead investigator. He had signed the bottom of the closing report himself. He had written the conclusion. And in the autumn of 1984, 4 years after Carol Dempsey disappeared from a parking lot in Cedar City, Utah, he stamped the file closed and placed it in an evidence archive where it sat for the next 40 years. What he could not have anticipated was a retired deputy named Frank Olson, who in the winter of 2021 found himself with nothing but time and a box of old photographs, and who kept returning to the same feeling he had carried since 1980. The feeling that something in that investigation had never made sense. That the answers had always come just a little too easily. That the dead ends had always appeared just a little too conveniently. And that the man who always seemed to have an explanation had never once seemed to grieve. To understand what happened in that parking lot, you first have to understand who Carol Dempsey was, and to understand why it took 40 years to name the man who took her from her family. You have to understand what it meant, in 1980, to trust a badge. It was a September evening, and the high desert of Iron County was doing what it always did at the beginning of autumn, pulling the heat back into the earth early, leaving behind a kind of thin, cool clarity that smelled of juniper and dry grass. The mountains east of Cedar City had already turned at the ridgeline. The valley below was still the color of summer, but just barely. Carol Dempsey was 31 years old. She stood 5'4", had dark hair she wore pinned back for work, and had spent the better part of the last decade being the person that everyone in her orbit called first when something went wrong. She was a licensed practical nurse at the Valley View Medical Center, had been for 6 years, and the other nurses on her floor described her the same way in interview after interview in the months following her disappearance: methodical, calm in a crisis. The kind of person who remembered your birthday and your mother's name and your kid's soccer schedule without writing any of it down. Her supervisor would tell investigators that Carol was the one staff member who routinely stayed late without being asked. Not because she was a pushover. Because she couldn't leave if she thought someone needed her. She was also a mother. Her daughter, Melissa, was 9 years old in September of 1980. Her son, Danny, had just turned 7. Their father, Carol's husband of 12 years, drove a delivery truck for a regional food distributor and was often gone before the kids were up. Carol had built the daily architecture of their lives almost entirely on her own. The school lunches, the homework, the bedtime routines, the Saturday morning pancakes she made from scratch, because the box mix, she said, tasted like cardboard and false advertising. The Dempsey family rented a 3-bedroom house on Kershaw Drive, a quiet street 2 miles from the hospital. They had a collie named Buster who had an ongoing and enthusiastic relationship with the neighbor's garden. Carol kept a small flower bed by the front porch. She drove a 1977 Buick LeSabre, the color of green olives, that she had named Gerald, with no explanation that her husband could ever extract. This was Cedar City in 1980. Population just under 10,000. The kind of place where the high school football coach had held his job for 22 years, and the clerk at the hardware store on Main Street knew your father. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was not just present in community life, it was the architecture of it. You knew your neighbors. You knew their kids. You trusted the people who had been vouched for by people you already trusted. And in Cedar City in 1980, you trusted law enforcement the way you trusted weather forecasts and church bulletins. Not blindly, perhaps, but without active suspicion. The sheriff's department was small. Everybody knew somebody on it. On the evening of September 11, 1980, Carol finished her shift at Valley View at 7:15 p.m. A colleague named Diane Ritter walked with her as far as the main entrance and watched her cross the parking lot toward Gerald. They had made plans to have lunch the following Tuesday. Diane remembered Carol waving once without turning around. A backward wave, casual, the wave of someone who expected to see you again soon. Gerald was found the next morning, still in the parking lot. Locked, Carol's purse was on the passenger seat. Her house keys were inside it. Melissa and Danny had slept in their beds that night without knowing their mother was not coming home. At 7:58 a.m., on September 12, 1980, a nursing supervisor named Margaret Hollis called the Iron County Sheriff's Department to report that a staff member had not shown up for her morning shift and had left her vehicle in the hospital parking lot overnight. The dispatcher logged the call at 8:02. A deputy was sent to the scene at 8:24. The deputy confirmed the vehicle, confirmed the purse, ran the plates, and called it in. By 9 a.m., the case had been assigned to Detective First Class Raymond Schell. He was 44 years old, 18 years on the force. He had a reputation for closing cases. He was a deacon in his congregation, coached youth basketball on Wednesday evenings, and was, by every account that would be gathered in the months and years that followed, the most respected investigator in Iron County. The county sheriff would later say, in an interview with the Spectrum newspaper, that Ray Schell was the kind of man you thanked God you had on your side. He took the case. He interviewed Diane Ritter. He interviewed Margaret Hollis. He interviewed Carol's husband, Dale, who was located at a truck stop in Beaver County at 7:45 a.m. on a documented route and was cleared within 24 hours. He interviewed neighbors, colleagues, the hospital administrator, and the two physicians on Carol's floor. He documented everything, filed everything. In the first 72 hours, the investigation appeared thorough, methodical, and appropriately urgent. A search was organized. Volunteers combed the land between the hospital and the surrounding residential areas. The Iron County Sheriff's Department contacted the Utah Bureau of Investigation. Nothing was found. No body. No physical evidence of struggle. No witnesses who had seen Carol Dempsey after 7:15 p.m. At 9 days, Detective Schell began to shift the investigation toward what he called voluntary departure. He noted, in a report filed September 21st, that Carol Dempsey had recently discussed personal matters of a sensitive nature with at least one colleague, and that the possibility of voluntary absence could not be ruled out. That note would later become the single most consequential document in the file. Because there was no colleague who had said that. There was no sensitive personal matter. The note had been written from inside a story that Raymond Schell was building, carefully, from his first day on the case, designed to close the file without closing the truth. Dale Dempsey did not believe his wife had left voluntarily. He said so to Detective Schell. He said so to the county sheriff. He said so to his pastor, his employer, and any reporter who would put a microphone near his face in those early weeks. Carol loved her children. Carol loved her life. Carol had been planning a Halloween costume for Melissa and researching new winter boots for Danny when she disappeared. She had not left voluntarily. Detective Schell listened to all of this with the patient, measured sympathy of a man who had spent 18 years delivering bad news. He took notes. He thanked Dale for his time. He called regularly to provide updates, each of which amounted to a gentle reinforcement of the same conclusion, that the evidence did not support foul play. that the investigation remained open, that they were following every available lead. By the spring of 1981, the search volunteers had gone home. The reward poster that Dale had placed in the diner on Main Street had been taped over once, then twice, then removed. The case appeared in a regional roundup of unsolved disappearances in the Deseret News in November of that year. 4 column inches, a school photograph of Carol from her hospital ID, and a phone number for the sheriff's department. No credible tips came in. Meanwhile, Detective Shell continued to file quarterly updates that noted no new developments. He would be promoted to detective sergeant in 1982. He would receive a commendation from the county sheriff in 1983 for his work on a cattle rustling case in the northern part of the county. He coached basketball. He attended his congregation. He was, by every observable measure, exactly the man everyone believed him to be. In 1984, he filed the closing report. Cause of disappearance, undetermined. Evidence of foul play, none. Classification, inactive, pending new information. He signed it. He stamped it. And Carol Dempsey's 847-page file went into a box. The years moved the way years do in a small desert town. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a kind of accumulating weight that reshapes everything so gradually you don't notice until you compare a photograph. Melissa Dempsey turned 19 in 1990. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's habit of remembering details about people that surprised them. She had grown up inside a specific and permanent uncertainty. Not the clean grief of a child who knew their mother was dead, but the unresolved kind, the kind that made her search faces in grocery stores well into her 20s. She became a nurse. Danny Dempsey enlisted in the Army in 1991. He called his father from a payphone in Fort Benning, Georgia, and told him he just needed to go somewhere that made sense for a while. Dale understood. By 1995, 15 years after Carol's disappearance, Dale still answered questions from the occasional journalist or true crime researcher with the same measured patience his wife's investigator had once shown him. He had never remarried. He still lived on Kershaw Drive. He had replaced the flower bed by the front porch twice, once when it died in a drought year, once when a late frost took it. He kept it going because Carol had kept it going. Raymond Shell retired in 1997 after 31 years of service. He received a standing ovation at his retirement dinner. The sheriff said, in his remarks, that Iron County was safer for having had Ray Shell in. The case file stayed in the archive. The box it lived in was relabeled once during a reorganization in 2004 and moved to a lower shelf. In 2007, Dale Dempsey was diagnosed with a progressive cardiac condition. His daughter moved back to Cedar City to be near him. She was a charge nurse by then, working nights, and she spent her days driving her father to appointments and sitting with him in his living room, watching old game shows he liked, and asking him, sometimes, to tell her what her mother had been like before she was old enough to remember. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, cross-referencing documents, and piecing together lives that deserve to be remembered fully. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind cases like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Carol. The case had been cold for nearly 4 decades when, in the fall of 2019, the Utah Cold Case Coalition began working with the Iron County Sheriff's Office to submit biological evidence from archived cases to a genealogy DNA program. The program worked by uploading evidence DNA to public ancestry databases, the same platforms where ordinary people trace their family history. and using partial matches from distant relatives to narrow toward an unknown contributor. The process was slow. It required patience, specialist genealogists, and a willingness to follow branches of family trees across county and state lines, sometimes for months, before a picture began to emerge. It also required evidence that had been preserved. In the Dempsey file, there was a single item that had been collected in September of 1980 and never adequately processed. A partial DNA sample recovered from the interior of Carol's car that had been noted in the original evidence log, attributed to an unknown individual, and then, in a summary report filed by Detective Schell in October of 1980, categorized as inconclusive, likely contamination. He had known what it was. He had categorized it as nothing. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 2021 when Frank Olson picked up the phone. He had been a deputy in Iron County for 23 years before retiring in 2008. And he had never worked the Dempsey case directly. It had been Schell's entirely from day one. But he had been around long enough to remember Carol's face from the poster in the diner. He had been around long enough to remember the shape of the investigation, the way it had seemed to flatten out faster than missing persons cases usually did. He had been around long enough to notice that Ray Schell had never seemed rattled. That had always bothered him. Not in a way he could articulate in 1980. Not in a way that would have held up against the reputation of a decorated, 18-year investigator. Just a low, persistent sense that something in the geometry of the case was wrong. He called the Utah Cold Case Coalition because he had read about their work in the newspaper, and because he was 71 years old and had decided he did not want to die with the feeling still sitting in his chest. He told them what he remembered. He told them to look at the evidence log. They found the sample. They submitted it. 11 months later, in February of 2022, a genealogist working the case traced the DNA through 3 generations of a family tree to a single individual. A man who had lived in Cedar City, Utah, in September of 1980. A man who, by the time the match resolved, had been dead for 4 years. Raymond Schell had died in 2018, at 81 years old, in a care facility in Washington County. He had been eulogized in 2 newspapers. His obituary mentioned his 31 years in law enforcement, his devotion to his congregation, and his love of basketball. It did not mention Carol Dempsey. When investigators presented the DNA evidence to the Utah Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, along with Frank Olson's account and a reanalysis of the original evidence log, which now showed clear signs of summary manipulation in Schell's 1980 memos, the picture that emerged was not complicated. It was simply, completely damning. Raymond Schell had known Carol Dempsey. The exact nature of that connection was reconstructed over the following months from interviews with surviving colleagues and family members, from medical records, and from a series of handwritten notes found in Schell's personal effects that his family had not known existed. He had encountered Carol at the hospital. He had been treated there twice in 1979 for a minor procedure, and she had been his floor nurse on one occasion. In 2022, one of his former colleagues, now in her late 70s, told investigators that Schell had mentioned Carol by name at least twice in casual conversation in the months before her disappearance. That it had stood out to her, vaguely, because he was a married man. That she had not known what to do with that feeling in 1980, that she had thought about it many times since. The Utah Attorney General's office held a press conference on September 11, 2022, 42 years to the day after Carol Dempsey walked across the hospital parking lot and raised her hand in a backward wave she never knew was a goodbye. The lead investigator, they said, had been the perpetrator. He had not simply failed to solve the case. He had constructed the investigation as a mechanism to ensure it would never be solved. Every lead that might have pointed toward him had been redirected. Every piece of evidence that could have identified him had been reclassified or buried. For more than 3 decades, he had continued to represent law enforcement in Iron County, continued to be trusted by the community he had violated, continued to receive commendations from the institution whose authority he had weaponized against a woman who had no reason to suspect him. He had died peacefully in a care facility. He would not face trial. There would be no sentencing. There would be no moment in a courtroom where the full weight of what he had done was placed before him publicly, formally, permanently. What there would be, the only thing there would be, was the truth, confirmed by science, reconstructed by a retired deputy who couldn't let go of a feeling, reported by an office that followed the DINA where it led, regardless of where it led. And Carol's name, spoken aloud at a press conference, in the same city where she had lived and worked and raised her children and kept her flower bed, for the first time in 4 decades connected to the right story. Melissa Dempsey was 51 years old when the Attorney General's office called her. She was at work, a charge nurse, night shift, the same career her mother had built. She stepped into a supply closet to take the call. When she came out, she did not go home early. She finished her shift. Her father, Dale, had died in 2014. He had not known. She had made peace, she said in a later interview with a Utah television station, with the fact that he had not known. He had spent 34 years waiting for an answer, and she was glad, she said, that the waiting had not been the last thing he did. That he had died in his house on Kershaw Drive, in his chair, with Wheel of Fortune on the television, not in the middle of a phone call that explained what had happened to Carol in the parking lot of Valley View Medical Center on the evening of September 11, 1980. What she felt about Raymond Schell, she said, was not something she had words for in English. She said it was something older than anger and quieter than grief. Carol Dempsey had wanted to be a head nurse. She had been taking the continuing education courses for it. She had told Diane Ritter about it over lunch a week before she disappeared, that she was thinking about applying for a supervisory position, that she was a little nervous about the interview process, that she wasn't sure she was ready. Diane had told her she was already doing the job, that the title would just be catching up to the reality. She never got to find out if that was true. The legacy of the Dempsey case has been the subject of ongoing discussion within the Utah law enforcement community. In 2023, Iron County implemented new protocols for cases in which a lead investigator has a prior documented contact with a victim. The changes are procedural and modest. They do not undo anything. They exist because a man with a badge once built a labyrinth around a murder and walked through it every day for the rest of his life, and because the only thing standing between his secret and the light was an 11-month genealogy search, a sample that had been mislabeled as contamination, and a retired deputy who trusted a feeling he couldn't quite name. There is a version of this story in which Raymond Schell's secret dies with him, in which the sample in the evidence log stays labeled as it was labeled, in which Frank Olson doesn't pick up the phone that Tuesday morning, in which Carol Dempsey's name remains attached to a closed file and a 4-column-inch newspaper entry and a photograph on a reward poster that faded to nothing in the window of a diner on Main Street. We do not live in that version. But it was closer than anyone should be comfortable with. What does it mean for a community when the person they trusted to find the monster was the monster? What do you do with 40 years of safety that turned out to be a performance? And how many other closed files, in how many other counties, were closed by the same careful hand? Carol Dempsey was 31 years old. She drove a green Buick LeSabre named Gerald and kept a flower bed by her front porch and made pancakes from scratch on Saturday mornings because the box mix tasted like cardboard and false advertising. She waved goodbye to her colleague without turning around because she expected to wave hello on Tuesday. She was someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's friend. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to fight for her. She deserved better from the badge that stood over her case and closed it against the truth. The truth found her anyway. It took 42 years, a genealogy database, a retired deputy, and a sample that was never actually contamination. But it found her. Justice came for Carol Dempsey after 42 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because the truth does not always come easily. But it does not disappear just because someone powerful wants it to. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.